Okay. Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. I'm really happy to be here speaking to you all. And I'm recording this on my laptop from my living room in Toronto, where I'm visiting my family right now. As you know from my bio, I work as an assistant professor of critical Muslim studies at University of California, San Diego. And I just want to say thank you to Dr. Tosif Mir, who extended this invite to me very generously and, answered all my questions, some of which were ridiculous. And so I just want to say thank you, Dr. Mir, for your patience with me. So in order to guide me, there is this stereotype that, old professors rant a lot. And as you can tell, I'm quite old and I also rant a lot. So I have a PowerPoint guiding me so that, I do not go over 40 minutes. That's the goal, 35 to 40, right? I mean, we're all zoomed out. Our focus is not that great these days. I know mine isn't. So here's the PowerPoint, and I hope that, this would be productive in helping you align my words with an image. So let me share my screen. And it doesn't matter that I've been doing this for 3 years. It always does take me a bit long. So here is the PowerPoint. Okay, so writing your theoretical framework, that's the topic for my short presentation today. My email address is here on the screen, and I wouldn't say I'm slow at responding to emails, but I do get a lot of emails, and so it might take me a little bit longer to get back to you. But if you have any burning questions, anything that is not clear from what I'm saying today, please do drop me a note, question, concerns, anything. Okay, so here's my email address, but you can also find it on my university's website. Okay, so before we talk about theoretical framework, I just very quickly want to talk about what theory is. There is this understanding that for those of us who are, racialized sovereignty. So how we make sense of the world, how we, come to understand our place in the world, from, ever since we were children. So Terry Eagleton has this book, and I can't recall the name because it's from 1970s or 80s. And there is this quote about how it's children who begin to theorize, so we are theorizing even as children. So we are always theorizing. So, how do we challenge the truths out there about our lives, our histories, how we build the base for ourselves and our futurity, how we want to create an otherwise that challenges our current world order in which, lives of people like us, who are at the margins, and I mean a heterogeneous us here of Kashmiris, Dalit, Muslims, other marginalized peoples, in my context, such as Black peoples, Indigenous peoples, Latinx peoples, who are written off as people with, with no futurity. That's the world order that we've inherited. So just to give an example again, as you can see on my screen, I'm sure all of you know Audre Lorde, powerful queer Black feminist scholar. You might know her work. I can't remember, Cancer Journals, which was really, really powerful. So, I mean, all her work is powerful. This is from 1980s, this quote is from 1980s, and she was trying to think about the place of Black women in this, holding hands with white women kind of solidarity. And she was saying that, white women's concerns are so different from that of Black women's and, queer Black women's. And so there is this quote from her that is often circulated. I'm sure you've seen it. Even if you've read it 100 times, I think, when you read it for the 101st time, you'll still learn something different, because I know I do, from reading Audre Lorde's work, from reading work of Frantz Fanon and others. So she says, some problems we, as in with white women, share as women based on gender, Some we do not. You, white women, fear that your children will grow up to join the patriarchy and testify against you. We fear our children will be dragged from a car and shot down in the street, and you will turn your backs on the reasons they're dying, right? So this is, so her theorizing of feminism is one that absolutely centers race and sexuality. There is no solidarity, there is no sister power, women power. All of these for her are things that are just meant to erase Black women and their struggles. Okay, so this is her theorizing. So we can say that in this code, she's theorizing what Black feminism is for her, is to her. Okay, so that's an example of theory. Again, another example that comes from Lord is, I wouldn't say poetry as a genre, but let's say even if we understand poetry as a genre, what is the function of poetry? Of course, there's this whole Mirza Ghalib and, young people, when I was young, like we've all gone through that phase where we listened to Ghalib and all the words made sense to us. And so it's not that kind of, that poetry, of course, like was also really powerful. How she is talking about theory is in a way that disrupts, the whole idea of literature as formed by mostly the work of cis white men. Okay, so her quote here, and she says, again, this is from 1985. She says, "I speak here of poetry as a revelation or distillation of experience, not the sterile wordplay that too often the white fathers, white theoreticians, distorted the word poetry to mean in order to cover their desperate wish for imagination without insight." And I say this to my students all the time, that this phrase imagination without insight is not something that just sounds smart, but try to think of it as an ethic that guides you in your dissertations, that guides you in your research projects, in whatever you're writing, right? What does it mean to think about imagination with/without insight? How are you grounded in the experiences? How are you grounded in the struggles that you want to write about? And this does not mean that, Kashmiri students should only write about Kashmir. Muslims should only and always talk about Islamophobia. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that how we are situated in this world absolutely has an impact on our approach to the world, on how we read, how we understand, how we come to make sense of our world order. So all of this knowledge, all of these, deep reflections are really important before you sit down to really think about or, think through what your theoretical framework is, okay? Okay, so I'm not going to go through all the details, but for those of you who are who are trying to think about what theory is and who would like to read more, I absolutely recommend this article from 1991 by Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks, and this article is called Theory as Liberatory Praxis, and you do not need to have institutional access. If you Google this, the title with PDF, you should be able to access it. And it's a really powerful article that I make my students, we teach the series of courses on theory and how to write honors thesis. And every time I teach the first part of that course, this reading is on my course outline, and I like to go back to it again and again, because she talks about theory as grounded in experience, and experience is not something that just comes from nowhere, out of nowhere. Experience is also constructed through the words that we have, through the things that we can think through and think about. Okay, so and one of the things that she also talks about, she talks about that how there shouldn't be this sort of gap between theory and practice. Of course, critiquing white scholars too, who like to theorize the world without having any of the experiences of oppression, of colonialism that, they like to theorize with fancy words, okay? I would say the same for, Brahmin scholars as well. But, the other important thing that she says, which is when you read the article, and I hope most of you do check it out, is she talks about how theorizing is not done in isolation. It is always relational. It is always done, among structures. Nothing that you do can solely be focused on your struggle if you're not taking care of the analytics, the practices, the structures of oppression that have made your oppression possible, or that has made your fight for struggle possible. Okay, so I really appreciate this article, and I really recommend that you all check out this article. Okay, the other one, again, I'm very quickly going to talk about this, is another classic, Black feminist scholar, Barbara Christian. She passed away many years ago in 2000. She has this article from 87 again, and it's not that I'm stuck in the 80s. That's not the case, honestly, but these texts are so powerful that, how we think about, how we hear everybody say the word Orientalism. How many of us have actually read Edward Said's book cover to cover? So it's that kind of, doing, really grounded work, big, thinking about the genealogies, the histories, where do our critiques come from? I think those things are really important in order to make us a good scholar. So Barbara Christian's 1987 article, The Race for Theory, again, it's printed in Cultural Critique. Again, this is one of those open access articles, so you do not need institutional access to get this article, okay? And I'm not going to, go through all the details in that article, though it's, it stands as a classic, and it's worth it to actually spend the whole thing, our whole 40 minutes on that article. But I just want us to, for those of us who are intimidated by theory, for those of us who think like, theory is out there, it's not for people like me, how can I theorize? I want you to understand that there are these longstanding critiques by Black feminist scholars, by Indigenous scholars, particular kinds of racialized scholars, by Dalit scholars, Muslim scholars, by colonized scholars, that talk about how theory has become a commodity, theory has become a possession, of people in power, right? So, think about how jargon circulates and how that jargon legitimizes the publishing of really, I'm going to say the word crappy, really crappy stuff that, doesn't make sense, but it's there in big journals, right? Because theory is seen as the domain of a few. And, Barbara Christian calls it academic hegemony, which it absolutely is. And the other thing that is really important to me, and I hope you continue to think through this, no matter what your project is this idea of self and other. So, we know that Edward Said talked about how there needs to be an other before the self can be created. So it's not that we have a self and we are creating an other, but rather it's the other way around. So you have an other that is, where you put in all the values, the traits, the characteristics of dehumanization, and then you construct yourself. I am not Black, I am not a criminal. Think about all of these, very violent, I wouldn't even say the word stereotype, because, these are things that have legitimized slavery and shooting of Black people in the streets. And again, I'm talking about my context because, I am a diasporic scholar, and diaspora is what I know best. And so when Black people are shot in the streets, right? So these stereotypes have an actual violence attached to them. So Barbara Christian says, something that is really powerful, and this is on page 54. She says, for many of us have never conceived of ourselves as somebody's other. Think about this, folks. I want you to think about this when you are crafting your theoretical framework. What is, how are you humanizing yourself, your people, the struggle, the alliances in how you are writing in your other? And we all write in our others, even when we are not intending to. Those are the erasures that we have. And for those of you who are interested, I have often talked about my own complicity. I've talked about how, as somebody, from this diaspora, still did not understand anti-Blackness up until later in my life when I was a PhD student. So I talked about Islamophobia, never talked about anti-Blackness, and the city where I am, the city that's home to me, Germany has a really large Somali Muslim diaspora, and even then I didn't think about Blackness, so I do talk about my complicity, and that's what I want you to think about. And again, Barbara Christian says on page 58, my fear is that when theory is not rooted in practice, it becomes prescriptive. This is how you should do things. This is the only way. It's my way or highway kind of thing. Exclusive and elitist, and eliteness is, elitism, whether you are, whichever university in the world you are in, you would find that, there is this, it's like high school, where everybody has these groups. So elitism is there. Okay. All right, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but Leanne Simpson is an Anishinaabe scholar who talks about theory from an indigenous feminist perspective. And I really want you to maybe pause here and, and read this for yourselves. Because I think, she gives us a different perspective, not a different, but, she gives us a more expansive and yet deeper context of what theory is. And again, this is another quote from, Mohawk scholar, again, indigenous here, Audra Simpson, and white settler scholar, Andrea Smith, and they talk about, theory as well. So I want you to read this quote as well, if you have the time, okay? Right. Okay. Some definitions, again, these are definitions that I think, you should have with you, you should have on you when you're thinking about your theoretical frameworks. For those of you who are yet to start grad school, once you're in grad school, you'll see people throwing around words like epistemology, ontology. Do not be intimidated. 90% of those people do not know what these words mean. And I'm not saying this to be facetious or cruel. I actually mean it, because there's a lot of work that goes on into thinking about the precision, the parameters, the genealogies of these words, and have to do that work. Of course, I haven't done all of that work here, though I have done it in my other work. But I just want you to have this so that you can continue to think with it and come back to it if you find this useful. So epistemology is, how are we understanding the world? How is it that we are coming to know this? What is knowledge for us? These are sort of some of the questions that we need to consider in order to think about epistemologies, okay? And ontologies is the nature of knowledge. And again, Diane Million, who's an Athabascan indigenous scholar, talks about, as an indigenous scholar, as a colonized scholar, I'm sure you know that US and Canada are settler territories. Indigenous peoples here are colonized. They have been colonized for over 400 years, actually since 1492, depending on which area you're in, which territory you're in of the Caribbean. For example, the whole Americas are colonized lands. And so she talks about, this idea of subjugating epistemologies that are non-hierarchical and non-human centered is not accomplished without violence, So subjugated knowledges that are, not seen as important, knowledges that are seen as, that are seen as inconsequential, knowledges that are not just erased, but even if they're brought in, they're like, yeah, what's the point? Like, why should we care about your concerns? Or why should we care about these theories? Okay, so those knowledges, to challenge Western-centric knowledge system that has human at its center, to challenge that, to challenge the vertical, hierarchical production of knowledge. All of this is not something that you can do sitting in your living room, or clicking like on Twitter or Facebook or one of those things. It's actually an interdisciplinary ethic of doing research where the streets are absolutely connected to the academia, right? So what Diane Million is saying is that our struggles are not separate. What is happening on the streets is absolutely brought into the classroom, and what is happening in the classrooms can be brought to and should be brought to the streets. So it disrupts, this binary of academia, as really, really problematic, and activism as holier than thou. So she's critiquing a lot of those binaries, and this is her way of understanding knowledge production, what epistemologies are. So again, I am giving this just as an example. feel free to read her essay, though I don't think it's open access, but it's in this book called Native Studies Keywords that defines various terminologies such as land, such as sovereignty, and epistemology, ontology, etc. Okay. Again, this is a definition for interdisciplinary research. You can read these sentences, but for me, interdisciplinary research is basically connecting the streets to academia. And it is laughable to me when people say they're doing interdisciplinary research because, they are drawing on Bourdieu from sociology and they're drawing on three key, Black thinkers in ethnic studies. That for me is not interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary for me is how is the knowledge that you are producing, how does it attend to various power structures? How does it attend to the streets, to the struggles on the streets, and how does it connect to what's happening in academia, right? So to break, disrupt this idea of academia as ivory tower, that for me is interdisciplinary research. Okay. All right, again, discourse, I'm sorry, I don't know why this slide is coming off like this. Again, discourse is a word that you hear again and again. And when you're sitting down to write your theoretical framework, as soon as you enter grad school, you'll hear the word discourse. And again, I'm not going to read through this definition, but a book, folks, that I strongly suggest, and again, I think it's one of those pirated sites. Well, one was shut down, but this is a book that you can find online. If you type the word and PDF, it should come up hopefully. But Sarah Mills is a Foucauldian scholar. She has a whole book on Intro to Foucault, and this book as well on discourse, where she draws quite a bit on Foucault. And there's this whole binary setup that Foucault was a post-structuralist, and so you deconstruct everything until nothing is left. And that is not true. There is a materiality to discourse. And this again goes back to my definition of interdisciplinarity, right? Discourse analysis, critiquing things, building things are absolutely, not just isolated activities that you're doing on your own. It has to be relational. It has to challenge the systems of power within which our understanding of the world are imbricated within, right? So challenging multiple colonialisms, challenging racism, challenging casteism, challenging Islamophobia, etc. Okay, so this is the definition. These are some of the definitions of discourse, but I strongly recommend that you get a copy of this book. Okay, Discourse by Sarah Mills by Routledge Press. Okay, this was supposed to go forward. Oh, it did. Okay, all right. So again, this was one of those setting up stages of what is theory, and now I want us to think about theoretical framework. Okay, excuse me. Okay, so what is a theoretical framework? First, I'm going to read these four key points that I have. Theoretical framework is the underlying set of assumptions, theoretical and ideas guiding the manner in which you have framed your central/main/key questions. And there is this like chicken and egg thing, like which came first, the egg or the chicken kind of thing. Because for me, usually people start with a research question and then they go to the theoretical framework. I think, as somebody who wrote a really long dissertation, my supervisor forced me to, make the space less between my lines. So with 1.5 space, I think I don't remember now, this is many years ago, my dissertation was still 340 pages or something. So I wrote a lot. And, I wrote all of this. I wrote all these different chapters. And at the end, I was again sitting there. I'm like, what is my research questions? Because I realized that, what I ended up writing did not necessarily there is no objective in that sense, but, it didn't necessarily align with the question that I began with, right? So if your questions are also shifting, that is not a bad thing. That is the sign of what I think, a good scholar, that you are able to find things that you didn't even expect, right? Like it's like going into the archives with your phone and your, iPad, whatever, and wanting to look into these two things, but coming out with like, material enough for two separate books and not necessarily related to what you went in for. So that again is, for those of us who do archival research, it's one of those joys. So, underlying, again, coming to this, for me, even though here I framed it that, first you have the research question, then you have the theoretical framework. For me, I think you cannot, even in your head, have your research question until and unless you have an inkling of how you're understanding the world. So for me, I think theoretical framework is where you begin in your thinking, okay? And I stand by this claim of mine, and people can contest it. I welcome all of that, all of those, challenges. Okay, so that was the first thing. The second thing is it's a set of key principles drawn upon to ground the thesis work. What grounds? What are some theories that really, really ground you? So, for example, I wrote my, the larger thing about my thesis was I wrote about my complicity as a person of color, as a diasporic person, and I thought about my complicity in structures of violence as it related to white settler colonialism and racism, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, etc., and caste. And so, I knew where I needed to begin, in my head, even if I didn't have my research question that was very clearly spelled out, I went to critical Indigenous studies. I went to Black feminist studies because I knew the analytics and the ideas and the histories these fields can offer me that would drive my project, that would allow me to think with these texts. And I don't mean draw upon them extractively, but I mean draw on these texts in ways that could help me, give guidance to what it is that I want to look into. Third, it's a lens used to ask thesis questions and analyze data, okay? If your project, let's say, which is a very raw sort of, I need to give a better example, but let's say it's a difference between a what and a how sort of question. It could be a difference between quantitative and qualitative kind of thing. If you want to examine, the deep psychic life of racial violence, you are not going to do a survey with 60 people, right? That's a different kind of project, doing focus groups, doing one-on-one interviews, maybe looking at some key historical or contemporary texts. That would be the way that you would go if that was indeed your question. So it is the lens, used to ask your question and analyze data. A theoretical framework sets the ground for how you are designing your entire study. So for me, it is one of the most important, parts of your proposal, your PhD proposal or your master's proposal. I don't know if master's has a proposal. It doesn't where I am, but your PhD proposal and your actual dissertation writing. And fourthly, it's a kind of language/discourse used to explore research questions. How are you framing your question? If, for example, you can show attention and care and that, and respect to, let's say, even using particular words. So instead of saying Blacks, how do Blacks, fight racism? Which I think, to say Blacks, it makes Black people into a possession. It is the way in which, white people counted Black people as cargo. So instead of saying Blacks, always say Black people, Black peoples, or whatever, but, not just Blacks, right? So it's even about these sorts of distinctions that allow your supervisor or your reader to think about how you are approaching, your particular study. So that's, so these are the 4 marks of that. Okay. Key concepts, again, these are the parts of, this is how you think about your theoretical framework. You need to define your key concepts. So whether it's governmentality, again, that comes from Foucault. So it gives the idea that your thesis might be Foucauldian in nature, or hegemony, Antonio Gramsci. What kind of concepts are central in your work. So for example, for me, the concept of complicity was driving my entire data, right? Wasn't driving my entire dissertation. So that was important. Articulation of key ideas of theory/theories, right? What are the, let's say, even though I drew on critical indigenous theory as important in my theoretical framework, I couldn't cover the whole field of indigenous studies. It's huge, even in the context of North America. And so I had to draw on particular theories. These are the theories. So for example, the notion of human was important in my research. And so I wanted to examine how indigenous scholars were theorizing human, the notion of human, not as a possession, not as something that came post 1492, human that has certain attachments to land, human that is situated in kinships, human that is, that has a spirituality, all of those things, okay? So, and then the third thing is relationship of theoretical ideas to research questions, thesis, questions. Example, will you be, okay, so this is the example that I always give to my students. Will you be drawing on Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism or Karl Marx's theorizing of alienation of masses to think about class struggles and disparities? What I'm saying is that if you are thinking about, if you're thinking with Cedric Robinson's work, Black scholar who passed away in 2017, if you're thinking with his idea, his theorizing of racial capitalism, what that tells me is that race is absolutely central in how you're thinking about capitalism. Okay. However, if you're thinking with Karl Marx, who did not talk about race, and you are looking at, class struggles, that would tell me that, the bourgeoisie, proletariat kind of discourse might not allow you to think about race and racial difference. So this is what I mean. Like if your question, if your question doesn't make space for theorizing of racial difference, racial violence, and you are drawing on Cedric Robinson, I would advise you to go back and revise your research questions. Okay, the fourth thing is form of argument about why this set of theoretical ideas is relevant to topic. Why are you using these particular ideas over others? Okay, I mean, even to think about class disparities, even to think about Islamophobia, there are so many different theories out there. To think about, even words such as decolonization, I can use Frantz Fanon's A Wretched of the Earth or Algeria Unveiled, and I can use, let's say Audra Simpson's work in Mohawk Interruptus. I can draw on Eve Tuck's theorizing of decolonization. How and why are you choosing to work with particular set of scholars and ideas that you are drawing on? Okay, so this is what I mean by form of argument. Okay. Look into the histories and genealogies of your main concepts. Don't just, because, your uncle has used it and cousin has used it and 4 friends have used it. Don't just use concepts, that become a fad. I mean, academia is, people use words such as otherwise building, world building, and I don't know what that means. I have huge respect, for the ideas underneath those phrases or words that I read from people, but I'm struggling. And because I'm struggling, I am hesitant to use them in my work, okay? Look into the histories. What are the lives these concepts have taken and the genealogies of your main ideas? Okay, so, this is a quote that I really appreciate from Edward Said, that I'm not going to read the whole quote, but I really encourage you to pause your screen at this and read his quote read this quote from Edward Said and how he talks about how theoretical concepts travel. Because in order to write your theoretical framework, you have to, in order to be a good scholar doing this ethical work, you really need to be able to, and I'm not saying justify in a Western whatever sense, but you really need to be ethical and comfortable with the ideas that you're working with, right? So here I've said, I encourage you to pause and think about the ahistoric overreach, temporal transcendence, and circulation of certain keywords and ideas that become detached from their origins. And I'm not saying that words cannot be detached from their origins. So, but but you need to know those histories and like why are you using these in different ways than how they were intended. So for example, academic industrial complex, not many people know that the phrase industrial complex was coined by President Eisenhower, right? And academic industrial complex is seen as such a radical thing, to critique the academic industrial complex. But so much of that, history of how these terms came to be, how they were mobilized, what they stood for, what Eisenhower's theories or worldview were, all of that is erased in how everybody just uses these words now. Okay, critical university studies is another sort of field. Even my own field, critical Muslim studies, I'm like, what does the word critical mean here, right? So that's the kind of work I'm encouraging you to do in order to be good ethical scholars. Okay. Variations in form, content, and style. I'm just going to give two quick examples. So one is the positivist normative theoretical framework. This is not the work I do, but I'm giving this as an example. So here, theory has a predictive capacity. That is, you have a prediction, and you are going to quote unquote. Well, I shouldn't do air quotes, but you're going to test that prediction. That's what I mean by theory has a predictive capacity. It assists in discovering truth or answer to question, right? Like, this is my truth. This is how I'm going. This is how I found it. This was my prediction, and this is how the data aligns with my prediction. That sort of work. Theory is explanatory in nature. It can explain the world and how it works. And most importantly, general laws are driven from particular instances, right? So again, these very, very racist, ideas that Black youth are criminals, or this idea that the police is there to protect us. I mean, we know this is not true. Neither of those are true, right? But this is how they circulate in the world. And so this is what I mean by a positivist normative theoretical framework that doesn't allow for the groundedness. It doesn't necessarily allow for you to ground yourself in your research, explain what your relationship is to the questions you're asking. This one goes more for objectivity, that there is a truth out there, and if you do XYZ steps, you can go and attain that truth. Okay. The second kind of framework within which I operate is the non-normative or post-positivist framework. It is not premised on a hypothesis that can be tested. Less explanatory, assumes that lenses itself theory laden, which is something that I've been saying, that who are the people who can theorize, how do we approach this question? If I'm thinking about, this question of human, I'm approaching it through critical indigenous studies, and I'm approaching it through Black feminist studies. So my approach in itself is driven by experiences of marginalized, colonized peoples, and I'm thinking with them, I'm thinking alongside those texts. Typically less concerned with proving general law. I am not interested in saying this is the only way things are done, or it's one thing for me to say that, these are the ways in which violence is enacted on people, but it allows me, but this kind of research still allows me to attend to the nuances. It allows me to, understand the different ways in which structures work, right? So we cannot just say that colonialism is only always about racial difference, right? I mean, think about the example in Kashmir. It is about Islamophobia. It is about casteism. It is about, occupation of land, right? The genocide is not necessarily premised on racial difference as such, as it is understood in North America. So there is a no cause effect, relationship, interpretation, some form of hermeneutics, how you approach something, how do you justify that theory? It is relational Foucauldian theories of power, language, the power of words, the genealogies, the histories, so, and again, I've given this example of how, and I showed you the definition of discourse. So theoretical frameworks explaining what discourse is and how it operates. That's a part of your theoretical framework as well, okay? That you think discourse has power and it constructs certain experiences and histories through words, okay? So that's the post-positivist, non-normative framework, post-structuralist, you can call it that as well. Okay, so some guidelines when you are sitting down to write your own theoretical framework, whether you are doing this for your PhD proposal or your actual dissertation or your master's thesis, outline and define key concepts. Do that work. Don't just throw in neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has been defined by white scholars, such as I was thinking of Wendy Brown. That doesn't necessarily attend to colonialisms and racial difference. And neoliberalism has been defined in powerful ways by certain kinds of colonized and Black scholars. Draw on their work. Think about whose ideas you are drawing on. So two people can think of neoliberalism in very, very different ways. It's the same kind of difference between Marx's, theorizing of class difference and alienation of masses versus Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism, for example. Organize theoretical assumptions into some coherent order and articulate clearly in written form. Write. Nobody is born with, well, I mean, there are people born with it. I'm not, I don't have these, great ideas and I just open my laptop and sit and write it out. No, it doesn't happen this way. I write the shittiest drafts. The first draft is shitty. The second draft is a little bit less shitty, whatever. But you need to sit down and give some coherence. You need to write it out. Until and unless you do that, you will not be able to really own, not as a possession, but you really will not be comfortable ethically with how you are, expressing your relationship to certain ideas and keywords. Okay, apply to your questions, data, conclusions. Explain and justify why these theory sets of assumptions are central. If you think that racism and capitalism go together, then of course Cedric Robinson's work, is really clear. If you are thinking about, globalization and class struggles, think about, is Cedric Robinson enough? I would say then you have to think about, just from my context, the work that I do, you have to think about caste difference as well, right? So, and it's not that, one scholar will do everything. It's about how you bring different scholars into a conversation with each other that would make even your theoretical framework something that you can later on publish, okay? Remember this thing also that, you have to write your theoretical framework for your master's thesis, for your PhD dissertation. But once you are changing or, you're editing your dissertation for a book, it doesn't matter. You do not have a separate section called theoretical framework. But these ideas that you learn, they will guide your book. They will guide your entire project. So it's really important that you learn how to write your theoretical framework. Okay. I think I've talked a lot. So I just, just very quickly, I'll say read as widely as possible. For those of you who follow me on Twitter and read my posts that I don't read, I'm just being facetious. I mean, you cannot be a graduate student or an academic unless you are reading quite a bit, and read, across ideas. Here, I really, give students, and, we read a lot of Jamaican, Black scholar Sylvia Wynter, but read like Sylvia Wynter, who read physics and had to think about the bees and this and that, and she read across all disciplines, and this idea that her hair ribbons would fall out while she would be reading on her way from school to her home, and that's how much she read. Of course, when I say this to the kids, they're like, well, I mean, that's how I look at my iPad. But I really mean it. Read across theories, think about relationality. That's really important. Read all of these points that I have, but something, the last 2 points for me, the last 3 points, I would say, read other graduate students' theses and dissertations, depending on your level. If you're an MA student, read, your peers' MA thesis, read the theses that were on your topic written within last 5 years. And this actually is an exercise, an assignment that I do with my PhD students in class, right? So read their work. can you relate to the theories that you are working with? Does it make sense to you? Is it meaningful? Do you find yourself, maybe flourishing is not the right word, but do you find your brain juices working when you work? And, I think learning is such an embodied experience. So I don't just mean brain, but, are you feeling good in your body? For those of us, I'm Muslim, and for me, spirituality and my faith are really important. So I often think about it from that, from that perspective as well. I'm like, am I being extractive? Is this something that I can, be okay with and sleep peacefully at night, having drawn on this work? And there are folks, let me tell you, there are books written by, certain kinds of books written by Black scholars, which I've read, but I haven't found the ethics as yet of engaging with those books in my own work. So, not everything you read needs to go into your writing. You read to learn as well, okay? And be ethical about what you should read for your own knowledge, what you should draw upon and write into your academic and public scholarship. And this is really important. A practice I've cultivated is that, when I am in talks with Indigenous scholars, when I'm attending a talk by an Indigenous scholar, or even when I'm presenting with them, for example, I do not take notes. Because for me, this thing is like, let my body, let my brain remember whatever it is that it will remember. I'm not going to just write keywords so that I can use those words in my own writing without necessarily understanding that context. So I let my body learn whatever it can. So, what I'm saying is like, just figure out what your practices of ethics are in how you engage with other people's work. There's an image that should have shown up here in relationality. I'm sorry. But it was, it's an example that we can skip over. It was a figure of the Indian queen, and I've written about it. If you're interested, my article on it came out in 2019. I looked at a figure that they found in my archives at University of Toronto, and that archive allowed me to think about multiple colonialisms, casteism, and anti-Black violence and Islamophobia together. So I looked at 400 years of that figure's formation in along with all the, the ways in which it was shifting and changing. But yeah, for some reason, the image didn't get pasted. I'm sorry. Okay, some strategies. Clearly outline your basic theoretical assumptions under category of theoretical framework. Be consistent. Apply, so it's not like you, do this work on Orientalism and then you forget about it in chapter 3 and read your data without thinking about Orientalism, without thinking about Said's Orientalism, okay, and how he theorized it, for example. Be consistent. Apply across the terms that you're working with, the ideas that you're working with. Apply across entire thesis and data analysis. Return to concepts and ideas articulated in early theoretical arguments. Okay, be creative. Develop new theoretical concepts. Be the author of a theory or set of theoretical ideas. Remember that, it's not that you're inventing something new, but, bringing different theories. I mean, I think nobody invents, even Foucault, please, like, stole from Black feminist scholars. But, I just think that, bringing different theories together, which can help you in understanding what it is that you are doing. And from that, if you are, coming up with different parameters of a certain term that, or if you're, you are learning how to circulate it in ways that you think are more ethical, do that, write that, send it out to your friends to read, post it as a blog post, see the feedback that you receive, and then make it into an academic article, make your ask your supervisor to read it, ask your, people who support you to read that, okay? Okay, so, very quickly, I think I'm going to stop at this, but I just want to give an example of 4 ways to understand oppression. And this is an example of how your theoretical framework would differ based on how you are understanding these structures of violence. Okay, so the 4 ways are additive, hierarchical, intersectional, and interlocking, which is my approach. So additive is just like, if somebody is Black, they're also women, so they're doubly oppressed, but hey, they're also Muslim, so Islamophobia, so they're triply oppressed. It's like where you're adding all of these oppressions to say that, if somebody is not able-bodied, if somebody is a disabled, colonized, lesbian, woman, Muslim, undocumented, that person is the most oppressed. That is the additive approach, which I absolutely, do not recommend drawing on. Okay. The other approach is, I have a picture for this, and I'm very proud of my, I forgot what it's called, rectangle, triangle, right? Okay. So here at the very top of the triangle is able-bodied, heterosexual, upper middle class, cis white man. At the bottom is disabled, working class, lesbian, woman of color. In real life, on the ground, in interactions, encounters, histories, archives, oppression doesn't work this way. It's not that this man at the top will never have any encounters with anything, any of these, sorts of oppressions of the woman at the bottom. So we cannot think about oppressions as only vertical. We also have to think about it, as lateral violence. So even this category of people of color are always oppressed and white people are always oppressive. The issue with that is that the people of color category does not allow us to think about, religion. It doesn't allow us to think about, whether these people of color can also be colonizers. So for example, Indian academics, they are colonizers in the context of Kashmir. It doesn't allow us to think about caste privilege. It doesn't allow us to think about religious differences. So, what I'm saying is that these categories and these separations, the binaries and all of those things, they do not work. They are neat and clean, and they allow us to put things into categories, but that's really bad research. It's not only bad research, it's also harmful research. Okay, so that's the hierarchical approach, which we do not recommend, which I do not recommend. The third one is intersectionality. Many Black feminist scholars use the word intersectionality, and more power to them. The way in which I am thinking about intersectionality is, you have this idea that class operates on its own, and it's walking. Suddenly, hey, it bumps into race. And so now it becomes bigger. That's not how it works. Systems of oppressions do not work on their own, right? So for example, for capitalism to work, it needs the violent binary of north-south, right? For capitalism to work, it needs this figure of the hetero able-bodied white man, or not white, but hetero able-bodied man at the center. For capitalism to work, it absolutely needs the racial difference. Hence, I use the words by Cedric Robinson, racial capitalism, right? So as a structure, it's not that class is walking alone until it collides with race. That's what I mean by intersectional approach, and that's what we are not doing. That's what I recommend not doing. And this has huge impact in terms of how you are writing your theoretical framework. The way you are thinking about oppression really matters, okay? The fourth one is interlocking, which is what I recommend. I'm not going to read all of these, but you can pause your video here. So think of interlocking as, you juggling balls in the air. One is race, one is sexuality, one is gender, one is class, one is citizenship. You're juggling all these balls, and with two hands, and you're not sure which one you can allow to drop to the floor, right? Because all of these are important. How you hold on to all of these, depending on your research project, of course, but how you hold on to all of these in your theoretical framework, that is really, that comes with practice. That is important, okay? So just through thinking about the various ways in which we can think about systems of oppression, I've given you an idea of, of how you're thinking about the world makes appearance or gives form to your theoretical framework and to your research questions, okay? All right, okay. Again, feel free to pause your screen at this, the principles guiding my work in terms of, what power is, the function of theories, how I think about the notion of human, how I think about futurity. When you start to write your own theoretical framework, I really, folks, this is a practice that really works for me. And I, especially when I was a junior, when I was a young scholar, graduate student, Now, the older we get, like the more some ideas become norm to us, right? So I don't necessarily do this now, but initially, I used to write, what are the core principles guiding these 5 words, or these 5 pages, sorry, or what are the core ideas guiding this chapter? And I think when you try to distill your ideas, the complexities of those ideas into bullet points, it really allows you to articulate what it is that you're writing, where the gaps are in your thinking and in literature, and what your contributions might be. Okay, so I'm just showing this as an example, but I really encourage you to do this work. Okay, these are more examples, but this mostly comes from my work, but I'm not, you can see how I've situated myself. I identify as a Dalit Muslim woman. The ways in which I'm thinking about complexities, my own positionality. These are the sorts of, these were the signposts that guided my theoretical framework, because it allowed me to think about, okay, this is what how I'm thinking about my complicity, I must draw on critical indigenous studies, I must draw on Dalit feminist studies, right? So I'm just giving this as an example of how my project was guided by how I live my life and my own histories, okay? Again, this is an example of land, theorizing of land from a Marxist perspective, where you think about land as commons to be shared by everyone, theorizing of land, from Western perspective, Western, not that critical theoretical perspective where land operates as property, or thinking about land from indigenous, feminist perspective, where land operates neither as a possession nor as property, but as a kin. And if you are thinking about land as your kin, as your relative, the way in which you think about, this work, the ways in which you think about land and all that is built on it would be very different than if you were coming from a Marxist perspective, okay? So again, this is just an example, feel free to pause on it. I have Seneca scholar, again, that's indigenous here to North America, Seneca scholar Mishana Goman, and I talk about how she is theorizing land in this example. So again, these are just meant as examples. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I just want to say that I hope that what I've shared with you all is useful. Again, you have my email address, and if there are any questions that you come up with now or in a month's time, or when you're actually writing your theoretical framework, send me an email. I'm slow at responding just because I'm overwhelmed, but I will respond, okay? I hope this was useful, folks. Take care, and I look forward to seeing your questions. I guess you can put them on Facebook. I'm not sure, but however, let Tosif know, and I can also make another short video listing the responses to those questions. Okay, thank you again. Take care. Allah Hafiz.